Hello guys, and welcome to this very first tutorial about restlessness. Restlessness, as we know, is a framework developed on top of serverless.com. It helps us to bootstrap, to develop, to test, and to deploy our REST API backend servers on the AWS cloud computing platform. So, first of all, we should install restlessness. We can do it with the command npm I at restlessness /CLI -G. With this command, we will install, of course, the command line, so we will be able to launch every restlessness basic command from the terminal. Okay, now let's try to call the first command of restlessness. It is new with REST API RLN test, for example. This is the name of the folder or the project that we want to create. We can make it a little bit simpler like this. In this moment, restlessness is actually creating the folder, copying all the basic files like the package JSON, some basic folders and configuration file, and within the package JSON all a series of dependencies, both development and also production dependencies as well. Another thing that the restlessness new command is doing, it is also to install the restlessness core inside the project. This is another package of the restlessness family. So now that we have our project, we can close the terminal and open the project with the web store. Okay, here I just opened the folder that has been created inside the desktop REST API restlessness folder. And by opening the folder, we have some subfolders and some configuration file. So first of all, about the files, we have an slint file that will take care of all the linting. We have also a restlessness configuration file, the package JSON, and also a TypeScript configuration file. Talking about the subfolders instead, we have the source folder where there will be all of our endpoints and models and maybe utilities if we need. Right now there are just two TypeScript files, an exporter and a schedules exporter. Exporter will be the file that will export our endpoints to the root of the project, and schedules exporter, it is another file that will actually export to the root of the project all the schedules. As we would see, with restlessness we can create two kinds of Lambda functions. The first one is the endpoint or the API. That is a Lambda function that is called whenever a specific URL and method like get users or post articles, etc. It is called in our API gateway. But we have also the schedules. The schedules are Lambda functions. They are also called events that are called within a certain amount of time. For example, we can define a schedule that should be executed, for example, every day or every 3 hours or every minute, for example. If you are used to the Linux system, a schedule, it is nothing more than a cron job. So this is the source folder. Then we have the serverless services folder, and here all the serverless configuration files will be automatically created by restlessness. Up to now, when we bootstrap a new project, we already have two configuration files from serverless. One is the offline and one is the shared. So the offline, it is a file that we use to actually run our restlessness application in the local environment while we are developing. Instead, the shared JSON file, it is the first file that will be actually deployed online. So how we will see later, our application, our restlessness project or application can be composed of many serverless configuration files. There are specific architecture motivations. That is why we reached this solution. But right now it is a little bit too early to talk about this. What we have to do, what we have to know in this exact moment, it is this shared file. It is one file that will be deployed online when we will deploy our application to AWS. And it contains all the shared resources. So, for example, when we will create a database connection, it will be created inside this shared file and imported in all the others serverless files. Another folder of the Restlessness project, it is the environments or EMPs. As you can see, Restlessness already created for us 4 environments. One it is the locale for development purposes. One it is staging for the pre-production environment. That is already something that will be used on AWS. We have also the production environment file that is, as the name can say, the production environment that we will deploy on AWS as well. And at the end, we have also an environment file for testing purposes. As we will see, the environment is really useful, for example, to specify system variables like the connection string to the database. So, for example, in locale, we want to point to our locale database, so it will be localhost colon some port, for example. In production, it will be a production URL. In staging, it will be another URL. For test, instead, it can be again a local database, but maybe with another name. We will see all of this later. And the final folder, the main final folder of the Restlessness project is the configurations or configs folder that contains actually some JSON files, each one with a specific purpose. The main one are for sure the endpoints that will collect all the endpoints of our application, the models as well, also the plugins, the schedules as we already saw, these DAOs that are the data access objects that are our database actually, and also the authorizers. There are a lot of things that we can discuss about regarding this configurations folder, but we will see each of these JSON file as soon as we create some resources for the specific JSON. So now that we have a general idea of how the project works, let's start the very first command to actually start the development of our project. That is the dev locale package JSON script. Okay, what the dev locale script is doing, if we go inside here, it is calling the restlessness dev locale command. So what the dev command is doing, it is actually to create 3 web servers. 2 web servers are the restlessness web UI, as we will see, and the third web server is our own application of the project that we are developing. So it works in this way. The project we are developing, of course, it is a server, it's a backend, it's a REST API backend, so it will run on a specific port that is, in this case, the 3002. But Restlessness offers a web application to interact and to easily scaffold and create new resources inside the projects. To achieve this purpose, there are 2 other web servers, one for the front end and one for the back end, that runs on fixed ports. The front end in particular is reachable to the localhost 5000 door. So if we click here, the web UI should be opened. And here we have our Restlessness web user interface. So as you can see, first of all, here we have the name of the project. Then we have 3 parameters that are not set when we just start up the project, that are the organization, the app, and the region. We don't have to see these parameters right now. We can just for now compile like, okay, just to not have that ugly warnings. But all these informations are useful only when we will deploy our project to AWS. Before, when we are developing it in the local environment, they are not mandatory to be specified. So, as you can see, the web interface presents 6 different buttons or call to actions. So we will go through each of them. We already saw the infos where we can specify the deployment informations, that it is not really useful right now, but it is good to know. Then we have our endpoints, the schedules, services, models, and a final button, it is the Swagger user interface to interact and test our APIs. So endpoints, schedules, services, and models are resources. It means that through these buttons we can access a user interface to actually create, modify, or delete resources for this specific objects, while the Swagger it is just a user interface. So let's start with the services. The services are actually the serverless.com configuration file. We should create one service for specific purposes of our backend. For example, right now let's just define a default service, and it will be great like this. So we can go back to the dashboard. If we go in schedules, if we go in services, we can see the just created service default, and it is fine. We have to create a service before creating an endpoint. That is mandatory because one endpoint should be deployed in the realm of a service. So now we can go to endpoints. We can create a new endpoint. We should specify the service. Let's specify default. Then we should specify the route. So for example, let's create a route that will retrieve us all the users list. So /users get, because we are getting a list. This is a flag that we can leave unswitched right now. We will talk about this later. We don't have any communication with the database, neither any authorizer yet. So let's save the endpoints like it is. So as you can see, the new endpoint is being created and we have our users endpoint with the method get. Let's go back to our code. So what we produced up to now with all these commands. First of all, we created a new JSON file that is our serverless service file, default.json. If you open, you can see that there are already some configurations automatically configured from restlessness. And you should think that if we don't use restlessness, all this stuff we should compile every time by hand. And this can be really, really tedious. So just for now, after 5 minutes of using restlessness, you can understand, even from this really small configuration file, the power and how much restlessness improves the developer experience for creating serverless.com projects. So as you can see also, we have inside the functions objects our get users. So also when we created our endpoint, automatically restlessness added a new endpoint that is actually a Lambda function to our default service with specifying the handler function, which kind of events is it. So we know that it is a route HTTP endpoint. And if we go in the configs folder, we can go through the endpoints JSON file. As you can see, also the endpoint has been also added to this JSON file with all the variables. So this is the ID that is automatically generated, the route, the method, and everything else, also specifying the service name that is the default. So these are all configurations, but where is the actual code? Inside the source endpoints folder. So as you can see, a new folder has been created following the pattern method-route. If there are parameters, we will see later also this formula changes a little bit, but more or less it is like this, method and the path. As we can see, also restlessness created for this specific endpoint /function /lambda function /API 5 different files. We will go through each of them. So first of all, let's open the interfaces. In the interfaces files collects everything regarding the input of our endpoint. So as we know, one endpoint can have different kind of inputs. It can receive query string parameters. It can have parameters inside the path. It can even have a payload, a body that is sent mainly with the post and put HTTP methods, and it can even have some headers variable, but we will see all of this time by time. Right now we should understand that each of these objects are represented here and are automatically configured here. Since our endpoint it is a get, so it doesn't have a payload and it doesn't have any parameter in the URL, the only parameter that we can send it is query string parameters. So for example, we can say that when we retrieve the list of the users, we want, for instance, to specify a limit to the list. So we say limit that is a number. We can save, and now automatically our query string parameters will know that there should be a limit number. So if we go now to the second file, it is the validations. In the validation file, we are actually validating all the interface, all the inputs of our API. So as you can see here, Restlessness already configured it for us, and here there is already an error. Indeed, it's the property limit is missing in type object. Indeed, thanks to this UP-shape by interface TypeScript functionality that we built with Restlessness, automatically, since in the interface we specified a variable for the query string parameters, here the validation of that object is failing because we are not specifying the validation of the limit number. So we can say limit. For the validation we are using dot number, and we can say that this number should be required. We can save. As you can see, there is no error anymore because the limit key that is specified in the interface, it has been used here as well. We specified with a rule and everything works as fine. So the first step every time it is to define which kind of inputs our API can receive. Then we specify how these inputs should be validated. And third step is to actually use these variables in our code. So as we can see here, this is the handler of our function, and it will receive a request object, and our request rec object actually contains already some variables. If we do rec dot something, as we can see, it receives query string parameters, headers, path parameters, payload, session, validation results, etc., etc. So in this particular case, we know that our endpoint is receiving query string parameters, so we can add on top of here. Here, automatically Restlessness is checking the validations of our API. So for example, if we don't specify the limit from the front end, the API automatically will fail with a bad request error and the validation message specified, so the user can know that they are not specifying a limit variable, that instead it is required. If all the validations are passing, we can read our variables like this. Thanks to TypeScript, again, we have the suggestions. So query string parameters is an object of rec, that is request. If we open this request, it is exactly this interface that is receiving the query string parameters object. And so in this way, for how we built the things, we are able to know that the query string parameters is containing a limit number, and that limit, it is actually a number. So we know, of course, also the type of this limit number. Now, of course, we can use a connection to the database, as we will see later, to connect to the database and retrieve the users list. But for the purpose of this lection, we will simulate a users list with a mocked data, maybe like this. We can save our object, our array. So right now, thanks to this response handler, that is again a library from the Restlessness core, we will actually retrieve this users list to the front end that required it. Now, in order to make our Swagger UI work, we should create an endpoint from our project that will actually export the OpenAPI configuration file that is read from Swagger, and it will just show us all the list of APIs with all the inputs. So let's do it. Let's create a new endpoint default. The route should be OpenAPI with the get method, save. Now that the OpenAPI endpoint is created, we can go to its handler and copy and paste this snippet of code. Let's import the OpenAPI object from Restlessness. Now the only thing that we have to do, it is actually telling WebStorm to compile our TypeScript source folder in a dist folder as specified in the TypeScript configuration file. In order to do it automatically thanks to WebStorm, we can go to Preferences, type TypeScript here, and we can check this recompile on changes. So every time that we make some change to our source folder, these changes will be automatically compiled from TypeScript to JavaScript. So for instance, you can go here, do like this. And the dist distribution folder has been created. So as you can see, all the source folders with all the sources files have been compiled in JavaScript. And this is actually the folder that our Node.js and our also serverless application will read from. So it is really important to remember to compile the source files every time we make a change in order to see the result live in our browser. So let's start again. So now that Swagger is configured correctly, we can actually go to its function. And as we will see here, Swagger will present us a list of serverless service files. We know that every service file contains a list of endpoints, so we can close and open all its list. For example, here we have the users get. If we try our endpoint without passing any query parameters, as we can see, we have the expected error message, limit is a required field. So as you can see, the validation is working just fine. In the next video tutorial, we will check also how to define more complex routes, maybe by specifying a path parameters, or we will try to create some post URL in order to also test the payload, and we will see how to pass all these parameters from the Swagger UI.